Welcome to the Tewanee Joseph Show. I'm here with Dr. Brad Baker, proud member of the Squamish Nation. Brad, thanks for being here.
Yeah, Tewanee, it's really great to be here with you on your podcast here. I look forward to the conversation we're going to have.
You know, it's been such an incredible time. I know that you're busy out across this country and around the world, but we just had recently Truth and Reconciliation Day. And what does that mean to you? And what were you up to on that special day?
I think the big thing for me when we talk about Truth and Reconciliation Day is you break it down into categories of non-Indigenous people understanding our collective history, but also validating who Indigenous people are and valuing Indigenous perspectives. I think that's the big message I try to get across to folks, not only in British Columbia and, like you're saying, across Canada. And I'm actually off to Indonesia in about 10 days to speak over there around First Nations issues here from British Columbia. And I think part of us as all being human beings, we have the collective responsibility to truly understand our past and how difficult it was in this country we call Canada. And more particular, how it impacts my family and your family, Tewanee, the true history of the way our grandparents, our parents, our uncles and aunties were all raised in the Indian residential school system. And I think it's if we're able to bring in our non-Indigenous friends and colleagues into the conversation, create space for dialogue, it's better. And I think that's one thing I did this past weekend just prior to the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I had the opportunity to share information, not only my own family story, but my own journey in sports and education to strive for excellence, because I think we want to acknowledge the past, but what are we going to do to move forward as a collective? I think that's what we got across this past weekend, I hope.
You know, it's great that you bring that up, because I think it's, understanding where we come from, where we're at, and then where we're going, and thinking generations ahead. But also at the same time, your work in the education system has been so important in thinking 7 generations ahead. What has been part of your work in terms of getting the message out about not only the truth part, but how the reconciliation plays a role in everybody's lives?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think when I first started teaching like 30 years ago, we really didn't talk about the history of our country as First Nations people. And not only that, the First Nations perspective was not even part of our curriculum. So I look at the last 10 or 12 years, there's been a real push for all educators, no matter what their background is, to gain a stronger understanding. I think that starts with, adults teaching adults of who they are and who we are. And there's a great video clip by Dr. Alan Luke, and it challenges people to get to know their own story first. And so I think us as First Nations people, we've always known who we are, but you look at the non-Indigenous colleagues, how do we get to know who they are? And that kind of intertwines with us working together to ensure that we're providing equitable opportunities for every learner, and more importantly for Indigenous learners these days in British Columbia and Canada, because we were always deemed that we would be struggling in society or in school. But I think, you look at yourself and myself and some of our good friends who we grew up with, we've broken that glass ceiling for us towards excellence.
Absolutely. Building bridges is so important. And, just thinking about, the young people that have moved through, the school system in the last 30 years, have you seen a change in the last 30 years in terms of not only, Indigenous students themselves, but also the curriculum, teachers kind of learning more about culture and able to share? What kinds of changes have you seen over the last 30 years?
I think probably the big change I've seen in the last 30 years is probably all happened in the last decade, where there's the mandatory inclusion of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives in all grade levels, kindergarten to grade 12. I think that the partnerships that have been made across British Columbia with First Nations leadership, teachers federations, the provincial government, I think it's driven the agenda to where all folks must have a commitment to truth and reconciliation, and that's probably the most important part. And not only that, the BC Teachers Council issued a professional standard number 9, which basically states that every teacher must commit to it. And I think that's a huge shift. So now I can walk into, I look at my nephews and my nieces that have graduated through the system in the last 5 or 6 years. They learned a lot more about Indigenous history and Indigenous perspective than you and I ever did in school. And I think that's a huge shift. So if you look at that, you open it up around the 7 generations. I think that the generation today was way better off than us. But you look at 2 or 3 generations down the road, it's even going to be better around Indigenous content.
Absolutely. And I think, the ability for young people all young people that are going through the school system being able to understand a bit more about the culture and even where we live, I think is so important. We think, prior to, the 2010 Olympics and such, it was kind of a process. We're in a time of transitioning. And if you think back even to, probably, late 90s, there was a referendum on the treaty process. There was most of the stories you saw on television or on media was all negative about our
Mhm.
people. But I think those things have started to change, in a good way. And the work within the school system that you've been able to do, working with others and building bridges. And I think that's always so
Yeah,
important for people to understand.
building bridges is so key. I mean, it's so interesting. I'm glad you brought up 2010. As you know, we kind of I kind of followed your lead in the protocol team for that 2010. Even I look back to then, there's so much more that we probably could have accomplished. We all accomplished great things, but the doors weren't always open for us to be included in everything there. And I think since then, it actually opened the doors where there's nothing about us without us now. And I think that's a strong point that you've stated. And also our good friend Stockton, Chris Lewis, states quite a bit when you talk about the post-secondary world, Simon Fraser University. And I think those building the bridges is important because for so long, I think us as First Nations people were always walking behind decision makers or people making policy. But now we're at the tables at multiple levels in the corporate world, in the media world, and obviously in the educational world, where we're now part of the tables where major decisions are being made, and that's a huge shift in the last 10, 15 years for sure.
It really has been, and I was just able to be at the Board of Trade and just share the story, around the games, but also how, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Lil'wat really did take the lead on developing partnerships and then reaching right across this country, to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So the change has definitely been happening within the school system itself. I mean, I have young people, young children that are going to go into post-secondary school. What are some of the things that they should kind of be wary of, or some things that they should consider, as they get ready to go into university or college?
I mean, I think the one thing as you have, young men and women going into post secondary, as we all have relatives. I mean, one thing I'll state and still be liberal, it's still a tough society out there where racism is still alive and well in certain pockets of the post secondary world. But I think we also the presence of Indigenous professors, Indigenous departments, Indigenous advocates are way more relevant in post secondary when you and I went to post secondary. So I think part of the challenge I would say to the young folks going into post secondaries is ask their professors, ask their teachers, what are they doing to learn about truth and reconciliation? And we want to definitely make it more than a checkbox at the post secondary world. I think we've done a great job in the K to 12 system where it's more than a checkbox, but post secondary, uh, I think it's still a struggle. I mean, I look at my own experience where I just graduated with my Doctor of Education. I had one Indigenous professor my entire time I was doing my graduate work, which was shocking for 2020, 2024 and all that. But I think the more that Indigenous voices are part of the social justice movement is very important. And I think one thing I say to people too is when we talk about social justice issues, First Nations rights are completely different than mainstream social justice issues. And sometimes we get lumped into all that kind of stuff, but we're the original people of this land, so we got to make sure we keep that on the front of everyone's mind as we move forward.
And it's so important, as I was driving around yesterday, the city and such, and seeing, not only Indigenous people, First Nations people and such, wearing their orange shirts, but also non-Indigenous peoples wearing, proudly orange shirts and getting to know more about Truth and Reconciliation Day and what it really truly means. So, have you had some of those experiences while you were out over Reconciliation Day?
I think it's just, I mean, it's awesome. I look at my core group of friends that I've grown up with since I was 13 or 14, and some of them are running major corporations now. And I look at they consistently shared with me yesterday and the weekend what their organizations were doing to honor Truth and Reconciliation Day, Orange Shirt Day. And I look back 5 or 6 years ago, that wasn't happening. So I was very proud of my friend group who are non-Indigenous that were going into the dark corners to bring out the knowledge and share it with their broader teams. And I think that's where significant change happens because because you and I can go into conversations on a daily basis, hourly basis to advocate and tell folks what is right, but they have to do their own learning. So the more and more we have allies on our team, the better it is for everyone. And I saw that a lot this weekend, which was great.
Yeah, they become message carriers, and in our longhouse, it's important because we had oral traditions. And so people would
Mm-hmm.
come and witness, kind of the ceremonies that we would have. And it was their responsibility to go back to wherever they're from and be the message carrier for whatever they saw that day. And I think reconciliation is starting to become that people are kind of learning more and more as we go. There's more and more, not only private sector governments, First Nations governments, Inuit, Métis, being able to, stand proudly from who they are rather than kind of looking from the outside in on what's happening in this country, and just such big contributions across the country that we've had. And, reconciliation for you, not only in the education system, but also in the sports system. You're a big sportsman and you've grown up always, soccer, lacrosse,
Yeah.
and other sports. But, what have you seen out there in terms of kind of reconciliation through sport?
I think the biggest thing around reconciliation through sport is not only do we want to see more high level Indigenous athletes at the highest levels of sport, but also what are we doing in the broader based community to ensure that young First Nations, Métis, Inuit folks, children have the opportunity to play sport. As we know, sporting is quite an expensive endeavor for many families. So I think the one thing that I'm striving for in my different roles on different nonprofits like Via Sport BC and is to strive for equity. I mean, equity is big for me, and I think it's important that we're able to go into communities, have organizations go into communities to support sport on the ground, in reservations, in friendship centers, etc., where instead of asking families to continue to come to us, we now go to families to provide their opportunities. So you look at the bigger level. I mean, I'm very fortunate to to do some work with the Canadian Olympic Committee, and they're striving to bring in more Indigenous content into their plans to ensure that high performing Indigenous athletes are part of the next steps for the future Olympics. I was fortunate enough to be in Paris this past summer and watch the women's rugby team where they had two Indigenous athletes that won a silver medal. And so I look at those as strong Indigenous matriarchs, and they're very. When I say matriarchs, that means they're role models to me. And so how can we ensure that young Indigenous girls see that they can be in Olympic Games one day because there were two Indigenous athletes on the women's rugby team. And not only that, you look at there's one Indigenous athlete that's a teacher in Burnaby, and she's a wrestler. And so she's been the last few weeks or so leading up to Truth and Reconciliation Day, she's been making visits to non-Indigenous sports teams to provide her story of being a Cree woman in a sport that is really dominated by males, but how she used her cultural background to strive for excellence. And I think the more stories like that come out, it's good for everyone to hear those stories.
Absolutely. So why don't we continue on the conversation of reconciliations through sport? But for right now, why don't we take a break and listen to some incredible Indigenous music? Welcome back to the Tewanee Joseph Show. I'm here with Dr. Brad Baker, proud member of the Squamish Nation. And let's continue on our conversation through reconciliation through sport, and also your role, not only at the Canadian Olympic Committee on its B board, but also Soccer Canada via sport. And what have you been seeing, in terms of positive change and movement in the areas that you've been working with?
I think in all three of those organizations, via sport, the B board for Olympic Committee and Canada Soccer, sure, folks look to me for advice as a First Nations person who's I want to say a former athlete, washed up athlete, still an athlete in my mind. But I think part of what they ask me for advice, but they're also providing knowledge too. Because for so long, and you probably experienced this too, we'd sit on boards as the only First Nations person. And they would ask us for everything. They would ask us every question about First Nations people and not provide their own answers. But I think it's great on all three organizations. Folks are bringing in knowledge they've learned outside of the organization to be part of the conversation. And I hope, my big hope for soccer, football in this country, with FIFA coming here in 2026, with Vancouver and Toronto being host city, that it becomes, what is the social impact going to be for Indigenous people, and what is the legacy going to be for Indigenous people? I think we have an opportune time to crack open the door and walk through it, not only with Canada Soccer, with FIFA, but with the especially in Vancouver with the host nations of the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, but also in the Toronto area. There's multiple First Nations that overlap that city. How can we all work together to not only ensure that Indigenous content is visually throughout the World Cup, but not only that, after that, what are the opportunities for young children and youth to play soccer, to play football?
Absolutely. And it's so important. I mean, you talked about Paris earlier and, the Indigenous athletes that were there in rugby and other sports. What would you see over there? Did you meet other Indigenous peoples? Did you meet other Indigenous athletes, with Canada? Because I know that, for the summer sports, it was an incredibly successful Olympic Games for Canada, and Paralympics as well is so important. And we can't forget that. And I think so many people, when they mention the Olympics, they should always mention the Paralympics, because those athletes are absolutely unbelievable. And we had some incredible Indigenous athletes, over the years in the Paralympics as well. What did you see over there? I know I had a chance to go to the Canada France basketball game, but I left just before the Olympics started. But how was your experience over there?
Tell you, my experience was top notch. It actually started with a football game in Nice between New Zealand and Guyana. Then when I moved up to Paris after being in Nice, just being in the arena of sport, but the entire city had bought into the Olympics, which was awesome. And able to run into a couple of the families back there that from the rugby team that were Indigenous and non-Indigenous. I felt that they were very active in promoting. I go back to the Tokyo team, the women's rugby team, around social justice, Indigenous issues. They continued that into Paris, where they were continuing to learn about truth and reconciliation, and not only that, but bring it out to all the teams. And I was fortunate to sit with a few of the family members from the New Zealand team that beat us in the final, who were Maori, and they were impressed with the overall inclusion of First Nations artwork. You can see that on the warm-up tops for Canada throughout the years at the Sevens tournaments here in Vancouver and Langford. And so the feeling I got that every Olympic committee from nations with a large Indigenous population, Maori, Australia, Canada, they were all striving to go beyond the ceiling to make it more prevalent and relevant at the broader games. And I think and that's an extension from Vancouver, 2010, where we were part of everyday life there. And I think teams are looking to expand what they want to do. But overall, the experience in Paris was incredible. The venues were full. The French fans were cheering for every athlete, no matter where they were from. It was a great experience. I would rate it as my number 2 experience for Olympics after Vancouver.
After Vancouver, for sure. And, as I was just getting ready to leave, the city was just preparing and getting ready. And, but to see it back home, on television, unbelievable. I mean, that had to be probably, some of the most accessible games in terms of like getting tickets and, filling seats, because it's always been one of those things for past games. That's been one of the challenges. But I think just to see how it was in the opening ceremony is unbelievable. Were you there for the opening ceremonies?
No, we weren't there for the opening ceremonies because it was tough to get into the zone. They called it the gray zone. So we didn't have a ticket for the gray zone.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And I know that, meeting other Indigenous peoples, like you mentioned, New Zealand and Australia, obviously, I had a chance to work on the Rugby World Cup in 2011, and the Maori engagement was based off of Vancouver, about 80% of it was. And, the future games, summer games will be down in Australia as well. So it's nice to see kind of building and from your perspective, being able to see that. And I don't know if you had a chance to meet a couple of our friends, Willie Littlechild and Ava Hill are over there doing work on the Commonwealth Games. So
yes.
It seems like you mentioned earlier, the more people that can get out and share and build bridges, it's important. But did you get to run into them over there as well?
We had a quick conversation at the Canada House. But while you were talking there, you talked about 2011 World Cups. You look at 2010 Olympics here. Every major games from the Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand a couple of years ago, there's more Indigenous content in major games every year, and I think that's a testament to what you led for us at the Four Host First Nations in Vancouver, but also we set the model for people to be successful. And so you look in Paris. when they before each event, a French individual would come out and bang the pole on the ground, which meant the start of a cultural play,
Hmm.
cultural event in Paris and France, which was brilliant, which you really don't see a lot, right? And so, but I look at our leaders who are talking about the Commonwealth Games and the inclusion of that. I mean, I look at there's so many things going through my mind right now. A simple thing as the gifting of the chef de mission, Marnie McBean. I think your family was the first to give her a drum, and then successive drums after that. I know this year they didn't have one over there. I didn't see it. I didn't see Bruni Sheeran have one, but maybe he did. But I think that's significant because CBC, TSN, have done a great job explaining the significance of cultural gifts from First Nations people, Métis Inuit here in Canada, that the rest of the world sees that and they see us as a leader, which is awesome.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Marnie. It was incredible because I think, after 2010, there was more understanding because it was I think, at least the largest Indigenous gathering because we had representation from every province, territory, Inuit, Métis, national organizations and such. But it was actually through Marty had contacted Clara Hughes, a good friend of mine, and just sought permission to actually carry a drum to
Mm,
to Japan. And it was important because I think even those teachings that we may not know are getting out there are getting out there,
yeah,
and certainly after that with Catriona Lemaiton, and Bernie did have a drum. Don't know if he's carrying it around, but definitely
right.
did do that. It's been carried on for sure. But it's been a big part of not just the Canadian Olympic Committee. And you mentioned New Zealand as well. I know the work with Trevor Shaler because I was down there prior to the 2010 games and just invited the Canadian Olympic Committee to come up, the New Zealand Olympic Committee to come up into our house up in Squamish and host them
Mm-hmm.
and blanket them, if you remember that. So you're right, it has been growing. And how has it been for being on now the board for Canadian soccer? I think that's such an important part of you
Yeah,
growing up being a soccer player.
yeah.
But I'm so excited about this. I mean, I don't know how to express it more than just to say unbelievable. But how has your experience been on Canadian soccer?
Yeah, I tell you, man, when I put my name into the hat to be on the ballot and then being back in Montreal at the annual members meeting, get voted, it was like a pinch yourself moment because as you stated, I grew up playing soccer, including playing for my local team, my high school provincial team, then lucky enough to wear the maple leaf as a under 16 player. It was awe inspiring to be for the confidence of the provincial and territorial organizations to support me, and then being on the board. They're so open. They're professional. They're open, and they want to learn. They want to strive to have an Indigenous, content reconciliation action plan where it's not just a superficial action. They actually want to strive for it for full inclusion, which is brilliant. And so um, and it even starts when I first did my first presentation to Canada Soccer a couple of years ago, just as a guest. Um, it started the archives people to search out within their archives how many First Nations Métis Inuit players ever played for Canada. So that's a great role model thing for everything. But no, it's an amazing 5 or 6 months so far, and I look forward to my next 2.5 years when my term ends, for sure.
Absolutely. And FIFA World Cup, 2026 is around the corner. Any insights into kind of, I know I have the chance to work with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh on that and kind of leading up. And it's a massive event. It's a world event. I mean, it's so massive. Any insights into, Canadian soccer or things that we should be doing or how we can support the team or anything like that as we start to get ready for 2026?
I think just anytime we have the opportunity as First Nations communities, if either the men's, the women's team, the futsal team, youth teams are ever in our communities, let's welcome them into our communities. And so you look at FIFA, I really hope that not only do we support our men's team at the World Cup here in Vancouver and Toronto, but teams that come to visit us, we give them a true Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh welcome here in Vancouver. But I think in the big picture, I think I've had the opportunity to have conversations with a few of the folks at Canada Soccer, and they want to continue to learn about who we are, so they can answer questions when it comes to the World Cup being here. And I think it's a great opportunity. And I also think I'm looking at the schedule ahead of time. I think Canada plays their second round robin game on June 21st, 2026 at BC Place.
Unbelievable.
So how can we make that a spectacular First Nations content within the structures of that game, right?
Absolutely. And just can't wait. And it's going to come quicker than people think. Like, just under 2 years, and it goes really, really fast, as we know. Now, Brad, is there anything that, people can do, or something you want to share, one or two things that you want to share with the audience, just about how we can kind of make a difference through reconciliation through sport or business or education? What can people do to start to make a difference and continue that journey that we're on right now?
I think the big thing for me, I mean, as we've always heard from our grandparents and our uncles, have an open heart, open mind as we move forward. But also, I think is to challenge the norm. And I think when I say that is, how do we break open the box that we live in and create robust frameworks and policies where we're challenging the system? And what I mean by that is I want folks to continue to challenge their workplace and what they're doing around truth and reconciliation, but also challenge their friend group, because we have to start to remove the stereotypes or biases some people might have towards us as First Nations people. But I think if we're able to have an open mind, open heart, that's going to go a long way. And, I like to use the tagline, go forward with courage. It's courageous work that everyone has to do. And I think if we all go forward with courage and help each other out on this pathway, it's the future generations that you started our conversation with. They're going to benefit from the decisions we make today.
Hoichika, I think that's good words, good teachings to share to everyone. I want to thank Dr. Brad Baker for being on the Tewanee Joseph Show. Thank you very much, Hoichika, brother.
Hoichika, brother. Take care, T.
Yes, you too. And now back to some more incredible Indigenous music.